Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Victor Newman had faced countless enemies over the decades, survived corporate wars, personal betrayals, family rebellions, and even brushes with death itself, but nothing prepared him for the slow, calculated siege now tightening around him as Jack Abbott, once again standing on the opposite side of the battlefield, orchestrated a ruthless campaign that threatened not just Newman Enterprises but Victor's very freedom. And this time Jack wasn't acting alone, because Phyllis Summers and Cain Ashby had joined forces with him, forming an alliance born not of friendship but of shared resentment, buried grudges, and a mutual desire to finally see Victor pay for the damage he'd caused to their lives, their careers, and their loved ones. It all began quietly, almost imperceptibly, with whispers of financial irregularities surfacing within Newman Enterprises, documents that shouldn't exist suddenly appearing in anonymous emails, offshore accounts traced back to shell companies Victor had once used in past power plays, and although Victor initially dismissed it as another failed Abbott attempt to rattle him, the cracks deepened when federal investigators started asking questions that suggested someone with intimate knowledge of Victor's darkest dealings had decided to talk. And Jack knew exactly how to apply pressure without ever getting his hands dirty, feeding the authorities just enough information to keep them digging while maintaining plausible deniability, all while publicly positioning himself as the reformed Abbott, the man who had learned from past mistakes and now stood for transparency and ethical leadership, a narrative the media eagerly embraced. Phyllis, however, was the engine behind the emotional manipulation, leveraging her sharp instincts and insider knowledge to identify where Victor was most vulnerable, reminding Jack and Cain that Victor never lost sleep over destroying others when it suited him, pointing out that this wasn't revenge, but accountability. And for Phyllis, this crusade was deeply personal, rooted in years of manipulation, gaslighting, and professional sabotage at Victor's hands, moments where he'd used her brilliance when it benefited him and discarded her without remorse when it didn't. And now she was determined to ensure he couldn't simply bully his way out as he always had. Cain Ashby's involvement shocked many in Genoa City, especially Lily, who saw his alignment with Jack and Phyllis as proof that Cain was drifting further away from the man she once loved. But Cain insisted this wasn't about ego or ambition, it was about justice, about exposing a system Victor had corrupted for decades. And privately, Cain harbored his own scars, times when Victor had undermined his leadership, questioned his legitimacy, and treated him as disposable, and now Cain was supplying financial expertise, connecting dots between international transactions and corporate fronts, translating complex data into a narrative prosecutors could understand, making Victor's situation exponentially more dangerous. As the pressure mounted, Victor's confidence began to fracture in subtle ways, his trademark glare lingering longer, his silences growing heavier, his refusal to confide even in Nikki raising alarms within the Newman family, because Victor knew this time was different. The threat wasn't a hostile takeover or a temporary scandal, it was prison, real jail time that no amount of money or intimidation could easily erase. And when Michael Baldwin reviewed the evidence, even he couldn't hide his concern, warning Victor that the paper trail was extensive and that someone had clearly spent months, possibly years, building a case designed to withstand Victor's usual legal maneuvers. Jack, sensing blood in the water, escalated his strategy, arranging for a high-profile business forum where he openly discussed corporate responsibility, indirectly condemning leaders who believed themselves above the law, remarks that reporters quickly connected to Victor, fueling speculation and increasing public scrutiny, while Phyllis leaked just enough information to keep social media buzzing, painting Victor as a relic of a corrupt era finally being held accountable. And Cain quietly met with regulators, ensuring they understood the international scope of Victor's operations, hinting at potential tax evasion, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The turning point came when subpoenas were served, not discreetly but publicly, cameras flashing as Victor's name dominated headlines, and for the first time in years, Genoa City saw the great Victor Newman look momentarily shaken, his jaw tightening as he realized the walls were closing in. And though he lashed out at Jack, accusing him of orchestrating a vendetta, Jack calmly responded that Victor had written his own fate long ago, that this was simply the consequence of years spent crushing others without accountability. Nikki pleaded with Victor to consider a plea deal, to think about their family, but Victor refused, insisting he would never admit guilt, never give Jack the satisfaction, even as Victoria began quietly preparing contingency plans for Newman Enterprises, recognizing that her father's incarceration could become a very real possibility, a realization that fractured the family dynamic, with Nick torn between loyalty to his father and a growing belief that Victor had finally gone too far, while Adam watched with a mix of grim satisfaction and unease, knowing that Victor's fall could free him or destroy him entirely. Behind closed doors, Phyllis wrestled with guilt, aware that her actions could permanently alter countless lives, yet every time doubt crept in, she remembered Victor's smirk during moments when he'd ruined her without hesitation, and she hardened her resolve, reminding herself that power without consequence was the real injustice. Kane too felt the strain, especially as Lily confronted him, accusing him of becoming obsessed with bringing Victor down at the cost of their relationship, forcing Kane to question whether this mission was worth losing everything else. But even then, he couldn't walk away, not when they were this close, not when the truth was finally surfacing. As the investigation intensified, a shocking twist emerged when authorities uncovered evidence suggesting Victor may have tampered with witnesses years earlier, a revelation that transformed the case from financial misconduct into potential obstruction of justice, dramatically increasing the likelihood of jail time. And when Jack learned this, he didn't celebrate, instead he prepared, knowing Victor would fight harder than ever, possibly dragging everyone down with him. True to form, Victor launched a counteroffensive, threatening lawsuits, exposing old Abbott's secrets, attempting to fracture the alliance by exploiting Phyllis's volatile reputation and Kane's fragile personal life. But this time the trio held firm, bound by a shared understanding that if they faltered now, Victor would emerge stronger than ever, untouchable once more. The climax loomed as a grand jury convened, Genoa City holding its breath while Victor stood on the edge of a fate he'd never believed possible, his legacy hanging by a thread. The titan who built an empire now facing the prospect of losing everything, not to an enemy's takeover but to the law itself. And as Jack watched from a distance, Phyllis waited anxiously for updates, and Kane stared at the data that had brought them this far. One truth became undeniable. For the first time in his life, Victor Newman was not in control, and whether he walked free or into a prison cell, Genoa City would never be the same again. Victor Newman had always believed that fear was the most reliable currency in Genoa City, that as long as people feared him, respected him, or needed him, he would remain untouchable. But as the grand jury proceedings dragged on and the pressure from Jack Abbott's alliance with Phyllis Summers and Kane Ashby intensified, Victor began to understand that fear alone could no longer shield him from consequences he had spent a lifetime evading, and the realization gnawed at him during the sleepless nights he spent pacing his study, replaying every ruthless decision he'd ever made, every secret deal sealed in shadows, every enemy he'd dismissed as insignificant, because now those ghosts were returning with teeth, sharpened by time and emboldened by the belief that the mighty Victor Newman could finally fall. The alliance against him grew more strategic by the day, with Jack carefully positioning Jabot as the moral counterweight to Newman Enterprises, hosting board meetings that emphasized compliance and accountability, deliberately inviting journalists to witness the contrast between his leadership style and Victor's iron-fisted rule, while Phyllis worked behind the scenes, feeding legal teams contextual details that transformed cold financial data into a compelling story of abuse of power, manipulation, and long-term corporate misconduct. And Kane continued to refine the financial narrative, uncovering connections between shell corporations that spanned continents, transactions disguised as consulting fees that prosecutors now suspected were bribes, and accounts Victor had assumed were buried forever. As the evidence mounted, Michael Baldwin's tone shifted from cautious optimism to grim realism, warning Victor that the prosecution was no longer fishing, they were hunting, and that Jack's fingerprints, though never visible, were unmistakably present in the way the case was being built layer by layer, airtight and methodical, leaving no room for Victor's usual intimidation tactics. Nikki, caught between loyalty and fear, watched her husband transform under the strain, his temper flaring more easily, his voice losing its commanding certainty, and in quiet moments she begged him to consider the cost, reminding him that their family had already paid enough for his wars, that this time the enemy wasn't another tycoon but the law itself. Yet Victor dismissed her pleas as weakness, insisting that conceding now would erase everything he had built, that admitting guilt would destroy the Newman legacy more thoroughly than any prison sentence ever could. Meanwhile, the Newman children fractured under the weight of uncertainty, with Victoria stepping into an unofficial leadership role at Newman Enterprises, bracing herself for the possibility that her father could be removed from power permanently, Nick distancing himself emotionally as he struggled to reconcile his love for Victor with the growing mountain of evidence suggesting that his father's actions had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed, and Adam oscillating between satisfaction and dread, knowing that Victor's downfall could finally free him from his father's shadow while simultaneously stripping him of the one force that had defined his entire life. As rumors of a possible indictment spread, Genoa City buzzed with speculation, former allies quietly distancing themselves from Victor, board members requesting emergency meetings, and investors questioning whether Newman Enterprises could survive a scandal of this magnitude. All while Jack remained outwardly composed, refusing to gloat but privately acknowledging that this was the closest he had ever come to truly defeating Victor, not through brute force but through patience, discipline, and alliances Victor had underestimated. Phyllis, however, found herself grappling with unexpected consequences as her role in the case began to surface through whispers and insinuations, old enemies resurfacing to accuse her of manipulation and self-interest, forcing her to confront the uncomfortable truth that while she believed she was fighting for justice, she was also relishing the chance to finally outmaneuver a man who had underestimated her brilliance for years, a duality that haunted her in rare moments of quiet when the adrenaline faded and doubt crept in. Kane's personal life continued to unravel as Lily confronted him again, her voice breaking as she accused him of choosing a vendetta over their future, of becoming so consumed with bringing Victor down that he'd lost sight of the man he once was. And though Kane insisted this fight mattered, that exposing Victor's corruption was bigger than any one relationship, the pain in Lily's eyes lingered long after the argument ended, forcing Kane to question whether justice could ever justify the collateral damage left in its wake. The investigation reached a critical juncture when a former Newman Enterprises executive stepped forward, offering testimony that directly implicated Victor in orchestrating illegal transactions and pressuring subordinates to destroy records, a development that sent shockwaves through Genoa City and pushed the prosecution's case from strong to potentially devastating. And when Victor learned of the betrayal, his fury was volcanic, unleashing threats that echoed with the desperation of a man who could no longer control the narrative, his rage only confirming to those watching that the once invincible Titan was unraveling. Jack seized the moment to solidify his alliance, reminding Phyllis and Kane that Victor would attempt to divide them, to exploit their weaknesses and past mistakes, urging them to stay disciplined and focused, because one misstep could still allow Victor to escape accountability. And though tensions simmered within the group, they remained united by a shared understanding that they were standing at the edge of history, on the brink of an outcome Genoa City had never truly believed possible. Victor's counterattack escalated as he authorized aggressive legal motions designed to delay proceedings, discredit witnesses, and challenge the admissibility of key evidence, tactics that bought him time but further eroded his public image, painting him as a man desperately clinging to power rather than a confident leader defending his innocence. And as each delay made headlines, public opinion shifted further against him, with commentators openly questioning how many times Victor Newman had escaped consequences before, and whether this time would finally be different. Nikki's breaking point came when she realized that Victor's refusal to compromise might cost him everything, including his freedom and his family, and in a tearful confrontation, she accused him of choosing pride over love, of sacrificing their future to protect an image that no longer served anyone. Words that cut deeper than any legal threat because they came from the one person Victor had always believed would stand by him no matter what. And for the first time, Victor was left speechless, staring at the woman who had been his anchor and realizing that even she was beginning to slip away. As the trial date approached, Genoa City braced itself for the spectacle. Reporters camped outside courthouses, analysts debated potential sentences, and whispers circulated about plea deals that could reduce Victor's jail time if he cooperated. Yet Victor remained defiant, publicly declaring his innocence and privately preparing for war, convinced that conceding would erase his legacy entirely, even as the odds stacked relentlessly against him. Jack, reflecting on the long road that had led them here, felt an unexpected heaviness, recognizing that victory over Victor came at a cost, that bringing down a man who had shaped Genoa City for decades would leave a void that no one truly knew how to fill, and though he believed accountability was necessary, he couldn't deny the weight of ending an era, a realization that tempered his satisfaction with solemn responsibility. Phyllis, too, felt the gravity of the moment as she stood on the precipice of vindication, aware that once the verdict was delivered, There would be no turning back, no undoing the consequences of their actions, and she wondered whether the peace she sought would truly arrive or whether it would be replaced by a new kind of emptiness, one not even Victor's downfall could fill. Kane, staring at the spreadsheets and timelines that had become his obsession, finally allowed himself to imagine a life beyond this battle, questioning whether justice achieved through destruction could ever feel like victory, and whether the person he would become after this was someone Lily could still love. The day of the verdict loomed like a storm cloud over Genoa City, with Victor standing at the center of it all, his empire trembling, his family divided, his enemies united, and for the first time since he built Newman Enterprises from nothing, Victor Newman faced a future he could not control, a future where power, money, and intimidation might not be enough to save him, and as the city waited, holding its breath, one truth became undeniable. Whether Victor walked free or into a prison cell, the myth of his invincibility was already shattered, and the legacy he had fought so fiercely to protect would be forever defined not just by the empire he built, but by the reckoning he could no longer escape. As the courtroom doors finally opened on the morning of the verdict, the atmosphere in Genoa City felt electric, thick with anticipation and dread, as if the entire town understood that history was about to be written, and Victor Newman walked into that room carrying decades of dominance on his shoulders, his expression stern and unreadable. Yet those who knew him best could sense the strain beneath the surface, the weight of a future no longer guaranteed. Jack Abbott sat across the aisle, calm but alert, his presence a quiet reminder that this moment had been engineered through patience rather than brute force, while Phyllis Summers clenched her hands in her lap, her confidence wavering as the reality of what they had set in motion finally crystallized. And Kane Ashby stared straight ahead, jaw tight, silently rehearsing the consequences of victory or defeat, knowing either outcome would alter his life forever. When the prosecutor began outlining the charges one final time, financial fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, each word landed like a hammer, echoing through the room and through Victor's legacy, and though his attorney argued fiercely, challenging credibility and intent, the evidence presented over weeks of testimony had already etched a narrative that was difficult to erase, a story of a man who believed himself untouchable and acted accordingly. The jury's deliberation stretched agonizingly long, hours bleeding into a tense silence that forced everyone involved to confront the magnitude of what was unfolding, with Nikki gripping Victor's hand in a rare display of vulnerability, Victoria silently calculating next steps should the unthinkable occur, Nick avoiding his father's gaze out of fear of what he might see there, and Adam watching with an expression no one could fully interpret. When the jury finally returned, the room seemed to shrink, every breath held as the foreperson stood and delivered the verdict, guilty on multiple counts, phrase that reverberated through the courtroom and shattered the illusion that Victor Newman was above the law, sending shockwaves through Genoa City and leaving Victor momentarily frozen, his face betraying disbelief before hardening into a mask of defiance. Sentencing was scheduled immediately, and though Victor's legal team argued for leniency, citing his age, contributions, and family ties, the judge's words were measured and resolute, emphasizing that power did not exempt one from accountability, and when the sentence was announced, significant jail time, the finality of it all settled like a heavy fog, suffocating and irreversible. Nikki's quiet sobs broke the silence, Victoria's composure cracked just enough to reveal fear. Nick closed his eyes as if in mourning, and Adam exhaled slowly, recognizing that the man who had shaped his life more than anyone else was no longer the force he once was. Across the room, Jack felt no triumph, only a solemn acceptance that justice, however necessary, carried a cost no one could escape, while Phyllis struggled to reconcile her long-sought vindication with the ache in her chest, realizing that winning did not feel as satisfying as she had imagined, and Kane, staring at the floor, understood that the battle he had fought so fiercely had ended, leaving behind a future that felt uncertain and strangely empty. As Victor was led away, he paused briefly, locking eyes with Jack, Phyllis, and Kane, a look that carried both fury and reluctant acknowledgement, a silent admission that this time, the game was truly over, and as the doors closed behind him, Genoa City was left forever changed, its most powerful figure reduced to a man facing the consequences of his choices, his empire continuing without him, his legend forever marked not just by dominance and fear, but by the moment accountability finally caught up with Victor Newman.